I didn't find the evidence in a safe. I found it digitizing blueprints for the charity's new library. Cost overruns wasn't just a folder. It was millions funneled into shell companies. My mother-in-law, Karen, and my husband, Christopher, were siphoning the charity I built to fund their lavish lifestyle. My silence was the first step of my accounting. They thought I was just the architect for their buildings. They had no idea I was the architect of their downfall. Where are you watching from? What's the most terrifying secret you've discovered about an in-law? Comment below. I'm reading every single one. Conflict at 11:51 at night. Retaliation complete by 12:03 in the morning. I didn't cry, I didn't ask why. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a balance sheet. The moment I saw the routed funds, the marriage ceased to exist. It became a failed acquisition. I sat in the dark of my loft, the glow of my monitor reflecting off the glass drafting tables. Most people would have panicked. They would have frozen the accounts, confronted their husband, screamed until their lungs burned. That is a reaction. I do not react. I engineer. Freezing the accounts would have triggered an alarm. It would have sent Karen and Christopher scrambling to cover their tracks, shredding physical documents and transferring offshore assets. Instead, I maintained absolute composure. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I opened my laptop and started rewriting the financial architecture of our charity. Over the course of several sleepless nights, I methodically dismantled their financial architecture, line by line, ensuring every audit trail remained hidden until the perfect moment. The interface of the banking portal glowed stark white against the dark room. My keystrokes were rhythmic, steady, unemotional. I didn't stop the flow of money. I simply exercised my fiduciary authority to reroute the financial plumbing into an escrow account I controlled. Every future cash flow, every inflated vendor payment they had scheduled for the next quarter was quietly rerouted into a blind trust that only I controlled. I set up automated routing protocols. If Karen approved a wire transfer for site surveying, the system would mirror the approval but intercept the capital. I became a ghost in their financial system. I watched their historical transactions process in real time, observing the structural load of their greed. They had been draining the charity for 2 years, spending millions on luxury vacations, imported vehicles, and private club memberships. They were continuing to steal, completely unaware that their loot was now dropping directly into a vault I held the only key to. They weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were going to be shocked that I'd stopped playing along. I closed my laptop at exactly 2 in the morning. My pulse was a steady 60 beats per minute. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of cold water, and looked out the window at the quiet city streets. The foundation for their collapse was poured. Now, I just had to let the concrete set. I had built the charity from nothing, designing every square inch of our facilities with my own hands. I knew the weight tolerances. I knew the stress points. Karen and Christopher thought they were clever thieves, but they were just sloppy tenants in a house I owned. Every single dollar they attempted to move from this moment forward would serve as irrefutable evidence of their intent. I didn't just want them stopped, I wanted them legally paralyzed. As I washed my glass in the sink, I felt a profound sense of peace. There is a specific kind of freedom that comes when you stop trying to fix toxic people and start managing them as liabilities. My husband was no longer my partner. He was a bad investment that required immediate liquidation. To understand how a structure fails, you have to look at how it was built. In my world of construction, you don't fight the stress, you calculate where it breaks. For years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family. I designed the charity's headquarters, secured the zoning permits, and worked 80-hour weeks to ensure the foundation was financially sound. I shouldered the entire financial burden. Meanwhile, Christopher and Karen took the credit. They were the public faces, the philanthropists cutting the ribbons and smiling for the press. I was the invisible wife, standing just out of frame, holding the clipboard. You might wonder why I stayed. Why does a capable woman allow herself to be relegated to the shadows while her work is stolen? The answer lies in the psychological trap of the manipulated. When you are conditioned to believe your value is tied to your utility, silence becomes an invisible chain of a survivor. I had rationalized my position. I convinced myself that their public success was our shared success. Now I realized love had been a subscription, and I was footing the bill. The cost of my silence wasn't just emotional, it was literal. I had normalized their exploitation. When Karen demanded we upgrade the charity's Gala budget by $50,000, I worked extra freelance architecture jobs to cover the margin. When Christopher took credit for the sustainable energy grant I wrote, I smiled and told myself it was for the greater good of the foundation. This is the trap. You give an inch to keep the peace, and they take a mile to build an empire. I had been paying the premium on a policy that offered zero coverage. Looking at the ledger now, the illusion evaporated. They hadn't marginalized me because I was weak. They marginalized me because I was the only load-bearing pillar in their lives. Acknowledging my strength would expose their complete structural incompetence. The pity I used to feel for Christopher's desperate need for his mother's approval vanished entirely. They were parasites, and it was time to fumigate. For 3 years, I had believed that if I just worked harder, if I just designed a better building, if I just secured one more massive donor, they would finally respect me. But respect is not a currency narcissists trade in. They only deal in extraction. Every late night I spent drafting blueprints. Karen was using the charity credit card to buy designer handbags. Every weekend I spent managing construction crews. Christopher was booking luxury suites for networking. My loyalty was their asset. My dedication was their revenue stream. I had built my life around a profound mathematical error. I had equated sacrifice with love. I sat in the darkness of my home office, reviewing the digital architecture I had just implemented. The invisible chain of a survivor was broken. The realization did not bring me to tears. It brought an overwhelming, razor-sharp focus. I was no longer a victim trapped in a bad marriage. I was a forensic auditor, examining a crime scene, and the perpetrators were sleeping just down the hall. The escalation began precisely a week later. Karen and Christopher started noticing severe friction in their cash flow. They couldn't access the diverted funds, but because my digital redirect was completely seamless, it looked like an administrative error on the charity's end. Instead of looking inward, they projected outward. Christopher cornered me in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning. He claimed the charity's accounts were mismanaged. He suggested, with a look of manufactured concern, that the stress of the new library project was affecting my sanity. Karen was even more direct. During an emergency board meeting that afternoon, she casually mentioned to the directors that I had become a liability. She suggested I step down from the board to focus on my mental health. They conveniently forgot that, as the founder, my bylaws required a unanimous vote for any board removal, a legal protection I had insisted on years ago, which they had foolishly overlooked. It was a classic defensive maneuver. This is known as a narcissistic injury. When a narcissist's control is threatened, they do not self-reflect. They cannot see their own faults because their entire identity is built on a fragile facade of superiority. When their reality is punctured, they attack the mirror. They needed a scapegoat to explain the missing money, and the quiet, hard-working architect was the perfect target. I sat across from them at the mahogany dining table, sipping black coffee, watching them unravel. They were trying to gaslight the architect about the building she designed. Christopher's voice grew louder, his gestures more frantic. He told me I was ungrateful, that I was ruining the family's legacy, that my incompetence was going to bankrupt the foundation. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just nodded and took notes in my leather ledger. "You're right, Christopher," I said, my voice perfectly flat and devoid of emotion. "The accounts are out of balance. We definitely need a full, independent audit." Karen's face went completely white. She quickly backpedaled, her voice pitching an octave higher. She claimed an audit would be a waste of donor resources, that it would create bad press, that they could handle the discrepancies internally. They were terrified. They wanted to oust me before I could look too closely at the numbers. They thought they were backing me into a corner. intimidating the meek wife into stepping away from the ledger. They didn't realize they were just walking further into the kill box. Every word they spoke was documented. Every attempt to block an audit was recorded as proof of their consciousness of guilt. I watched them scramble, their panic thinly veiled behind corporate buzzwords and fake familial concern. It was fascinating, from a purely clinical standpoint, to watch two people try to navigate a maze when I had already sealed all the exits. Seeing their desperation was not satisfying. It was simply the expected, cold outcome of their profound mismanagement. They were flailing in a trap they had unknowingly built for themselves. I smiled, a tight, polite expression that reached nowhere near my eyes. "Don't worry," I assured them. "I'll make sure every single penny is accounted for." Karen's hands trembled as she adjusted her silk scarf. Christopher refused to meet my gaze, suddenly very interested in his phone. They were entirely predictable. Their hostility wasn't a threat. It was confirmation that my trap was functioning perfectly. The facade was cracking, and the pressure was only going to increase. With the board meeting concluded, I went to work. I am an architect. My entire profession is based on the undeniable physics of reality. You cannot fake a load-bearing wall. You cannot lie about the tensile strength of steel. And you cannot hide $24,000 of missing concrete in a building that has already been poured. I pulled the original construction invoices submitted by Karen's preferred contractors. Then I drove to the site of the new library wing. I didn't bring anger. I brought a laser measure, a clipboard, and a structural engineer's eye. I bypassed the foreman and went directly to the installation zones. I cross-referenced their paperwork with physical reality. The invoices claimed they had installed premium-grade acoustic glass in the reading rooms, billing the charity at top-tier rates. I tapped the glass. It was standard, single-pane commercial grade. The price difference was $60,000. I checked the submittals folder on my tablet. They had brazenly forged my signature to approve these substandard materials without my knowledge, creating a paper trail that clearly pointed to their intent to defraud. The invoices claimed they had reinforced the foundation with high-yield rebar. I checked the initial pour logs and the ultrasonic testing reports. They had used the cheapest available materials and pocketed the massive margin. Every blueprint became an indictment. Every square foot of drywall, every linear meter of copper piping, every lighting fixture was a documented lie. They hadn't just inflated the costs. They had compromised the structural integrity of a building meant for children. They had traded the safety of the community for luxury vacations and sports cars. I spent 3 nights compiling the data. I didn't sleep. The adrenaline was pure and cold. I created a master spreadsheet linking every falsified invoice to its corresponding offshore shell company. I mapped the entire flow of stolen capital, cross-referencing material deficits with offshore deposits. It was a beautiful, devastating piece of forensic architecture. The numbers didn't scream, they didn't cry, and they didn't lie. They simply existed. A mathematical absolute weighting to crush the people who had tried to manipulate them. I audited the climate control systems next. The paperwork stated we had purchased high-efficiency, commercial-grade filtration units. The serial numbers on the actual units installed were for residential-grade, discontinued models. Another $40,000 diverted. The sheer scale of their operation was almost impressive, if it wasn't so incredibly sloppy. They assumed that because I was designing the aesthetics, I wouldn't check the procurement logs. They assumed my passion for the charity blinded me to the business of it. They were wrong. I compiled photographs, serial numbers, and manufacturer spec sheets. I bound the evidence in a thick black portfolio. The trap was fully loaded. It wasn't just a matter of financial discrepancies anymore. It was documented, physical fraud. The library they were using to boost their public image was the exact weapon I was going to use to destroy them. The building stood silent around me, a monument to their greed. I ran my hand along a poorly finished support beam. They thought they had built an empire. I knew they had built a prison. Every structural flaw was another year added to their federal sentence. While tracking the IP addresses tied to the shell companies, I discovered an anomaly. The routing didn't originate from Karen's accounts. nor from Christopher's private servers. The digital footprint traced back to a luxury condo leased under a corporate holding company. I dug into the registration, pulling public records and matching the tax identification numbers. The managing director was Jasmine. Jasmine was Christopher's 25-year-old executive assistant. I had known about their affair for 6 months. I had been keeping a close watch on her, though I initially dismissed her as a mere distraction. I had not realized until now that she was the one orchestrating the shell companies, treating my husband as nothing more than a useful idiot. I had seen the late-night texts, the hotel charges disguised as conference fees. It was just another item on the balance sheet, a predictable cliché I hadn't bothered to address because it didn't affect the charity's bottom line, or so I thought. I cross-referenced Jasmine's banking details with the shell companies. The truth shifted, revealing a criminal twist I hadn't anticipated. Jasmine wasn't a naive mistress. She was a professional grifter. She hadn't just seduced Christopher. She had manipulated both him and Karen. She was the one who introduced them to the corrupt contractors. She was the one who set up the offshore accounts. She was playing to their arrogance and their greed, guiding them to embezzle the funds while she quietly siphoned the profits from those very shell companies. I watched the transaction logs in real time. Jasmine was preparing to liquidate the offshore accounts and vanish, leaving Christopher and Karen holding the bag for millions of dollars in federal charity fraud. She had booked a one-way first-class ticket to Dubai for the morning after the charity gala. They thought they were the masterminds, but they were just the marks. I felt a cold wave of amusement. My husband and my mother-in-law had betrayed me to build an empire, only to be robbed blind by a girl fresh out of business school. They were so blinded by their own narcissism that they never realized they were being expertly played. I didn't intervene. I didn't warn them. I simply added Jasmine's routing numbers to my blind trust. If she was going to drain their accounts, I was going to ensure the drain led directly to my reservoir. I exercised my administrative override to reconfigure her automated transfer protocols. When she clicked the button to move the stolen millions into her untraceable crypto wallets, the funds would instead bypass her completely and lock into a holding account secured by my digital signature. The players were all on the board. The grifter, the embezzling husband, the narcissistic mother-in-law, and the invisible architect. They were all dancing to a tune I was composing. I closed the terminal and leaned back in my chair. The accounting was finalized. There was no sadness for the end of my marriage, only the cold, hard satisfaction of a perfectly balanced ledger. Checkmate was scheduled for Friday night, under the bright lights of their precious gala. Jasmine thought she was the apex predator in this ecosystem. She underestimated the person who built the environment. I reviewed the flight itinerary she had booked. She was so confident, so sure of her escape. I made a final adjustment to the security protocols on my trust. The net was tightly woven. No one was leaving this building. The annual charity gala was the crown jewel of Karen's social calendar. The grand ballroom of the city's most expensive hotel was filled with 500 of the wealthiest donors, politicians, and socialites. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. Vintage champagne flowed into crystal flutes. Christopher stood at the podium, wearing a bespoke tuxedo paid for by stolen donations, giving a tearful, impassioned speech about family legacy, civic duty, and community service. I stood at the back of the room by the audio-visual booth. My hand hovered over the master control tablet. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the hum of polite applause. And now, Christopher announced to the adoring crowd, his voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system, "My brilliant wife, Lauren, will unveil the architectural renderings for the new children's library wing." I pressed enter. I had filed a formal whistleblower disclosure earlier that day, making the evidence a matter of public record that I was now presenting under the Foundation's integrity bylaws. The massive, high-definition screens behind him did not show three-dimensional models of a library. They showed a high-resolution scan of a bank statement. It was a direct transfer of $150,000 from the charity's operating fund to an offshore account registered to Karen. The crowd went dead silent. The applause died instantly. I tapped the screen again. The next slide showed the forensic breakdown of the construction materials, the fake invoices next to photos of the cheap, substandard glass. Next slide. A flowchart connecting Karen, Christopher and Jasmine to the shell companies, complete with IP addresses, transaction dates, and the exact dollar amounts stolen from sick children. Christopher turned around, his face drained of colour, turning a sickly shade of grey. He looked at the massive screen, then out at the crowd, his mouth opening and closing, soundlessly like a suffocating fish. Karen dropped her champagne flute. It shattered against the marble floor, the sharp sound echoing like a gunshot through the silent ballroom. "There seems to be an error with the presentation," Christopher stammered into the microphone, sweat beading on his forehead. There was no error. I had already submitted my complete forensic portfolio to the federal authorities days prior, with instructions to intervene at the precise moment I exposed them. The heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. 12 agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation walked in, their tactical vests and badges flashing under the chandeliers. They bypassed the confused donors and walked straight toward the podium with clinical precision. I watched as they pulled my husband's hands behind his back and placed him in handcuffs. Karen began screaming, demanding to call her lawyer as an agent read her rights. Across the room, Jasmine was intercepted trying to slip out the side exit. An agent pinned her against the wall, slapping cuffs on her wrists. Her flight to Dubai was officially cancelled. I didn't scream. I didn't smile. I just watched the building collapse exactly as I had engineered it. The donors were whispering frantically, recording the arrests on their phones. The facade was completely demolished. My retaliation was complete, executed with the cold, unforgiving precision of a steel beam dropping into place. I placed the tablet down on the audiovisual console and walked out of the booth. I didn't look back at the stage. The accounting was finished. The ledger was balanced. The liabilities had been successfully liquidated. I walked out into the cool night air, breathing freely for the first time in 3 years. While the lengthy criminal trials and sentencing would follow in the coming months, the immediate seizure of their illicit assets was secured by the emergency court orders I had pre-filed, ensuring their financial empire crumbled the moment they were taken into custody. Christopher, Karen and Jasmine faced multiple federal charges for wire fraud, embezzlement and conspiracy. Their assets were frozen and seized. Their social standing evaporated overnight. The country club memberships were revoked. The luxury cars were towed, and they were left bankrupt, disgraced, and facing decades in federal prison. I reclaimed total control of the charity. By utilizing the blind trust I had set up, I recovered every single dollar they had attempted to steal, plus the extra millions Jasmine had tried to siphon into her crypto wallets. The board of directors, terrified of being implicated, gave me unilateral executive authority. This is the architect's retribution. If you want to tear down villains, you must first observe their structure. You must analyze their load-bearing lies, their weak moral foundations, and their hollow facades. You don't attack the walls with a sledgehammer. You quietly remove the pillars and let their own weight crush them. The collapse is always vertical, and it is always total. I didn't rebuild the library right away. The community needed something more fundamental. Instead, I diverted the recovered millions into a massive urban renewal project, designing and funding social housing for families who had lost their homes to corporate greed. I replaced a monument to their vanity with a foundation for survival. I spent my days on construction sites, wearing a hard hat, measuring concrete, and ensuring every single invoice matched physical reality. The charity was no longer a piggy bank for the elite. It was a lifeline for the vulnerable. Every family that moved into those clean, safe, well-designed apartments was a testament to the power of precise, methodical justice. I've come to realize that surviving betrayal isn't about ignoring the damage. It's about using the wreckage to build something stronger. When the people you trusted most try to bury you, you have to decide whether you are going to suffocate or use the dirt to plant a garden. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free from the anger that tries to define you. I didn't just survive their attempt to destroy me. I engineered a better world out of their ruins. I'm at peace now, watching the sun rise over buildings that actually serve the people inside them. The coldness is gone, replaced by the warmth of a life built on truth. If you believe that the truth, when used with absolute precision, is the most powerful weapon of all, hit subscribe and share this video for anyone who needs the courage to stand up. I am Lauren. I am moving forward, but I want to ask you, have you ever had to tear down your old life to build something better? Let me know your story in the comments.